The Soulsborne series is in my eyes the greatest set of games the industry has to offer. FromSoft have just consistently been able to deliver us banger after banger. I've ranked every boss in the series, so my thoughts on the rosters of each game are out there, but today I figured it was high time I go over my overall thoughts on each entry in Souls and give you my ranking of the games from worst to best. As always, this list is solely my opinion, though I will try to justify my reasons for each placement. Feel free to take my subjective takes on this subjective medium personally and whine like a little baby in the comments below, and let's get straight into the ranking. Demon's Souls was my final entry to the Soulsborne series prior to Nightreign, and it's safe to say that I outright did not enjoy this game at first, though I won't deny it still holds merit. Definitely not enough to be placed above any of the other games, but there were many elements I did really like. Many bosses were introduced through phenomenal cutscenes, and I had fun fighting lots of them. Having played the PS5 edition of the game, I can't deny that it is visually stunning, though it's clear to see that they didn't care to improve the sloppy gameplay of the original. This holds the game back significantly for me, as the combat just feels incredibly dated and far less smooth than recent games. Many of the areas in this game feel plainly unfair, particularly those in the Valley of Defilement art shown. Demon's Souls undeniably has some solid areas like Inner Ward and Prison of Hope, but I found myself frustrated in unreasonable circumstances so often that while I enjoy the overall experience, I can't justify giving this game a higher ranking in comparison to Miyazaki's multitude of masterpieces. The newest game in FromSoft's catalogue can't really be classified as Souls-like. It's not that classic Metroidvania with reactive combat like the rest of their games. Still, it's my video, I figured I may as well talk about it. You're free to skip over this segment. I wasn't expecting to like Nightreign all that much. I got the chance to play the closed beta, and I really didn't think much of it. I didn't dislike it, but aside from Dead Cells, I've never been much of a fan of roguelikes, and I thought the game would only really be fun playing with friends. I predicted that last part correctly at least, but I'm pleasantly surprised how much fun I've had with this spin-off. It's got a pretty fun gameplay loop, really solid combat, I love the class and relic systems, and the Night Lords for the most part are solid, Yolstor, Caligo and Animus being my personal favourites. Unfortunately, I share the sentiment so many fans have voiced that Nightreign just isn't living up to its full potential. Once you've played as many runs as I have, all the uniqueness wears off and you realise that every time you're taking the same path, looking for similar weapons, fighting the same enemies, it just gets so stale. While the Everdark Sovereigns were a great way to keep the game alive, I think only 3 of them improved upon the original Night Lords, with the other 4 being downgrades. It's a real shame since they could have been incredible. Deep of Night never really intrigued me that much, but I enjoy Nightreign and figured a ranked mode could be fun. But no, all they did was a static ramping up of enemy stats that makes the game vastly less enjoyable. Bumping up enemy HP and damage is never a fun way to increase difficulty. The red weapons are cool but don't do enough to make me want to play this inferior mode, and I'm tired of classic Nightreign. There's nowhere close to enough variety to make it a game I come back to time and time again. Hopefully all my issues are lessened by the DLC, and I have faith they will be, but as it stands, Nightreign just doesn't reach its high potential, and though I could see an argument for it being above our number 6 entry, I personally enjoy FromSoft's classic formula more. At least it's clearly better than Demon's Souls. I'm sure this would be most people's choice for the worst game in the series, but I can say with confidence that I really did like this game. Sure, it has a great number of flaws, but the atmosphere is amazing, the story is a satisfying deviation from the other games in the trilogy, and so many interesting concepts were introduced despite not all being successful. Whenever I return to Dark Souls 3, it frustrates me that the game didn't include bonfire aesthetics, since they were one of my favourite inclusions in Dark Souls 2. Unlike in Demon's Souls, you are given some permanent healing to go alongside the limited supply of life gems, which are far easier to come by than grass was in Demon's Souls. While I think this game deserves far more praise than it gets, it is undeniably flawed, with enemy placement often feeling incredibly unfair, hitboxes being completely broken, and the combat overall being probably the worst in the series. Boss runbacks are just way too long in this game, which I obviously find frustrating, especially when the runbacks are harder than the bosses themselves. Looking at you, Sauron. I still think the immortal hallway turtle in the Iron Keep is far harder to kill than any boss in the entire series. I can already hear the angry mob getting out their pitchforks for this one. I know Dark Souls is often considered to be the greatest game of all time, and I can absolutely understand it. The world design is near unparalleled, and the feeling when returning to Firelink Shrine after Blighttown is one of the best experiences in the series, but unfortunately we can't sit idly by and act like the second half of the game doesn't exist. The areas after Ranor Londo are rushed, and the bosses are some of the worst in the entire series. My biggest problem with the game, however, is more a common issue of the earlier games in the series, being just how much of the game's difficulty feels unfair. One of the best parts of this series is the immensely satisfying feeling players get upon overcoming a challenge, but I can only truly enjoy that challenge if it feels reasonable. My failure is based on my own lack of skill, rather than some poorly considered game mechanic. I remember getting cursed in the depths of my first playthrough, and taking an extortionate amount of time to cure myself and get back to progressing. These early games are littered with frustrating enemy encounters, and areas that on subsequent playthroughs you'll just rush through in order to avoid them. Of course, these areas are still present in later games, but they're just so potent in the first games that it really affects my experience. While Dark Souls has some great bosses, I find a large chunk of them, especially in the late game, to be either mediocre or downright annoying. Despite my many gripes with the first Dark Souls game, I absolutely love the interconnected nature of the world, and the atmosphere is absolutely perfect. I have to give this game credit for being the one that truly elevated From Software's design philosophy to be what it is today. Once again, I'm sure that ranking perhaps the most praised game in the series at only number 4 will make a lot of people mad, but the 9 out of 10 score I've given it speaks to how much I love this game. But in a series full of amazing games, some can't avoid missing out on the top 3, and for me, Bloodborne just doesn't quite make it. This game undeniably has one of the best atmospheres, incredible lore, and combat that differs vastly from previous games in the series. It also has, on the whole, one of the best worlds, though there are certainly some weaker areas, such as the Forbidden Woods. This game cuts back significantly on the unfairness of its predecessors, though some hiccups are still present. Bloodborne also has a notably stronger boss roster than that of previous games, especially those from the Old Hunters DLC, which is probably the best DLC in the series aside from Shadow of the Erdtree. The thing that holds Bloodborne back for me is the complete lack of enjoyment I get from the second half of the game. It includes bosses such as One Reborn, Mikolash, Murgo's Wet Nurse, and Moon Presence, all of which I dislike. Between the shadows of Yharnam and Gehrman, you don't get to fight a good boss in the main progression. While I adore that final showdown with Gehrman, it just doesn't make up for the incredibly mediocre endgame. The combat, however, is some of the best in the Souls series, with the rally system making aggression key, trick weapons and gun parries making encounters way more diverse than usual, and blood vials being probably my favourite healing item of any game, despite how annoying it can be having to farm for them. So while I absolutely love Bloodborne, being my first Souls game, it just doesn't quite compete with the entries above it. While Bloodborne may have been my first Souls game, Dark Souls 3 is the one I completed first. This is a game that made me fall in love with this series. Father Gascoigne was the first boss I considered great, but Dancer of the Boreal Valley was the first one to truly wow me. Fighting that boss was what truly made me understand the appeal of this series, and I was convinced nothing would surpass it. But then I fought the Twin Princes, and then Slave Knight Gale, and I was completely hooked. After I finished Dark Souls 3, I was inspired to go back and complete Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1, being the games I owned at the time. Beyond my personal affection for this game, it just presents a more polished experience than its predecessors, with combat being far superior to Dark Souls 1 and 2. The boss quality also increased dramatically, and I think to this day Dark Souls 3 has at least the second best boss roster in the series, and since bosses are my favourite part of these games, that hugely impacts my enjoyment. Obviously the weakest part of this game is the world design, with the first half in particular being home to some of the most boring areas in the series. While none of these levels can compete with the likes of the Swamp of Sorrow and the Frigid Outskirts as the worst areas in Souls, they don't compare to Undead Burg or Central Yharnam either. I agree the colour palette being primarily washed out browns and greys takes a huge toll on the visual appeal of the game, but it's perfectly aligned with its thematic tone. Changing this style ultimately would have weakened that, and this pared back use of colour leads to some of the most visually striking areas in the series, like Irophil and the Ring City. Dark Souls 3 is also heavily criticised for its linearity, but for me it doesn't affect the game too much. Of course I would prefer the interconnectivity and freedom of Dark Souls 1, but I don't mind not being forced to explore the areas more since they are generally weaker. Had this game been blessed with better world design, it could easily be my favourite Souls game, but I fully understand why FromSoft designed it the way they did to meet the lore and themes of the game. Despite these few minor complaints, in my opinion Dark Souls 3 stands as one of the greatest video games of all time, which is truly saying something considering it's only at the number 3 spot. This is one of the latest Souls games I finished back at the start of 2023, but it was easily some of the most fun I've had on an initial playthrough. I absolutely love this game, and that first experience especially was phenomenal. The combat is without a doubt the best in the series, and the difficulty ramps up significantly as a result. All of the encounters have a rhythm to them, and overcoming a vast obstacle in the game is the most satisfying it's ever been. Even just the first boss was an immense challenge, but the difficulty truly surpassed the other games when I got to Genichiro. Prior to this fight, the most attempts I'd spent on a boss in the series was a hefty 50, but Genichiro took that all the way up to 65. He's a perfect tool to force players to adapt to the game's combat, which is so vastly different to the rest of the series. It's even more gratifying when you rematch him for the third time, since you'll now likely be able to destroy him without taking a hit. The final boss of the game is also phenomenal. Ishin the Sword Saint is probably the hardest boss in the series on a first playthrough, taking me around 100 attempts to finally take down, and he ranks as my second favourite boss in all of gaming. On the whole, Sekiro's bosses are simply fantastic. As it stands, I think it's the strongest roster in Souls. One of the biggest arguments against Sekiro is the lack of build variety. However, I strongly disagree that this holds the game back. While it would be awesome to duel Ishin with an axe or Owl with a spear, I'd sacrifice that in a heartbeat for the flawless combat Sekiro presents. Prosthetic tools also offer variety, and I find all of them fun to use. They present interesting ways to approach encounters that wouldn't be possible without them. One thing I do dislike on the whole is the mini-bosses. While I do love some of them, such as the Armored Warrior and General Naomori Kawarada, most of the mini-bosses just serve as frustrating obstacles that halt progression. They're made even worse when encounters consist of repeated mini-bosses and basic enemies. I especially hate Lone Shadow Mask Naga, since he sends out a pack of Soulsborne dogs, which everyone hates, and the Lone Shadow duo is even worse. Can't really be called a Lone Shadow when you're very clearly not alone. That being said, Sekiro is one of the most consistent games in the series, with areas all being solid and lore that grants so much more meaning to each encounter, especially the battles against Ishin. I believe Sekiro is an indisputable masterpiece, and it's a miracle that it doesn't take the #1 spot. Where can I even begin with this game? It's claimed its place as the most awarded game of all time, and for good reason. The combat is a massive upgrade from Dark Souls 3, admittedly not as strong as Sekiro's, but it's a completely different style. This is amplified by the immense build variety, huge roster of unique weapons, and the ability to alter the skills of most weapons using Ashes of War. While the majority of minor bosses are mediocre, the main game contains some of the best bosses in FromSoft's catalogue. Radahn, Morgott, Malekith, Melania, Messmer, Rellana. This game offers some of the best fights in not just the Souls series, but in any game. People complain that the immense freedom given to the player makes the game far too easy, and while I agree that it can be less challenging than its counterparts, this can easily be remedied by leveling up and upgrading weapons to match the point you're at in the game. This gives Elden Ring a huge advantage over other games, since when you get stuck on an unfair boss such as the Godskin duo, you can simply go elsewhere and find another, more fair challenge to topple. On top of this, I feel the Souls series is constantly looked at purely in terms of difficulty, which boss or which game is the hardest. And while I absolutely agree that this is one of the best parts of these games, I feel it's unfair to disregard bosses or games just because they're easier than we'd expect from Software. Just take Sekiro's fight against the Divine Dragon for example, and compare it to the Godskin duo in Elden Ring. The Divine Dragon is an incredibly easy boss by comparison, but is so vastly superior to the Godskin duo in every way. On the other end of the spectrum are people who complain Elden Ring is too hard, but these complaints are usually made by people who get stuck on the Tree Sentinel on Margit. I've never seen somebody who's beaten the game without using a broken build speak negatively of it. I do personally find Elden Ring to be one of the easiest Souls games. Even on my dagger only level 1 run, I beat most bosses in a single attempt, though I don't think it's a massive problem since there are plenty of ways to make the game more challenging if that's what you enjoy. My biggest problem with Elden Ring is just how daunting it can be to start a new playthrough, since upgrading weapons and preparing your build takes so much longer than the average Souls game. Though honestly, I don't think this could have been improved much with the open world nature of Elden Ring. Sure, the game isn't perfect, but it's ambitious and does all the important things right. I'd much rather that than a bland and boring game that does nothing wrong. Elden Ring is a far greater spectacle than the other games in the series, with both levels and bosses feeling grander than ever before. It also feels very visually distinctive, with much more colour and life than the typically dull and dark Souls games, though it still holds true to FromSoft's classic bleak theming. It also has the best DLC in Souls, Shadow of the Erdtree, which is more substantial than most of the other games in the series, and provides a few great bosses. While it's certainly flawed, and I don't love all the decisions they made with that expansion, it's just so clearly the most refined experience FromSoft have delivered us. Even without the DLC, I still would have placed Elden Ring as my favourite Souls game, but Shadow just elevates it even further. Elden Ring takes the title of my favourite Souls game, and stands as what I believe to be the most masterfully crafted game of all time, unsurprisingly coming from the hands of Hidetaka Miyazaki. So that concludes my ranking of every Soulsborne game from worst to best. Of course, this ranking is entirely objective. Gaming is entirely objective. My opinion is obviously correct and superior to everyone else's. Yeah, you laugh at my jokes, but that's truly the attitude many people have when voicing disagreement in my comment sections. I welcome respectful discussion, but if you lack the capability to acknowledge the subjective nature of this medium and respect opinions that differ from your own, just don't bother engaging with my videos. For the rest of you, I hugely appreciate your viewership and hope I might have earned a like and subscribe. See some of you in the next one.